Well, hello everyone, and welcome to today's session focusing on DevSecOps. Um, Over the past 5 years, 76% of all vulnerabilities were from applications. So given this radical shift in attacker focus, it's really time to embed security within development. So DevSecOps sets to relieve the costly and stressful delays that occur when security testing is performed late in the game. Better early, and it's never too early. So today's webinar is going to be focusing on the processes and tools for shifting left so security can happen early and often. So my name's Victoria Steed, and I'm the Director of Marketing here at Crosslake. I'll be helping to moderate today's session. So before we get started on DevSecOps, there's just a couple nuts and bolts I'd like to get out of the way. So if at any time you think of a question, please don't hesitate to reach out via the questions feature just on the right side on the toolbar. We'd love to hear from you. We'll do our best to address questions as we go, and time permitting, we'll open the floor to Q&A at the end. A recorded version of this webinar will be made available via email together with a PDF of today's presentation. So to those of you just joining us, welcome. I'd like to introduce our speakers for today, Kim Walters and Jeff Martin. Kim Walters, Crosslake's our managing director, has over 28 years of management experience in technology and engineering, including 18 years within Microsoft's engineering division. Kim has proven expertise in developing a strategic vision and helping lead large teams to execute on the vision and strategy using agile and iterative approaches. She'll also be joined by Jeff Martin. He is the Associate VP of Product Management at WhiteSource. Jeff has spent the past 15 years in product roles, helping both the organizations he's worked for and their customers transform and measure their business processes, development, and importantly, QA. He especially enjoys cultural and mindset transformations for their ability to create lasting progress. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it off to Kim, who can speak a little bit more to the frameworks and strategies we'll be covering today. Kim?
Great, yes. And Jeff, if you can, I can bother you to forward the slides there.
Really?
No, we're still
there we
seeing
go.
the title slide.
Just like a delay there.
That's okay. We can go to the next slide. So thank you, Victoria, for the nice introduction. And I'm really excited to be here with Jeffrey presenting kind of on a partnership with Crosslake and with WhiteSource and some great offerings we have for you guys in store to help you guys improve your businesses. But just a tad about Crosslake before we begin. For folks that are not familiar, we consist of about 130 plus practitioners. We are a global based company. So we have practitioners in US, Canada, Asia, Europe, and even Australia, so and South Africa as well. And what's unique about our company is really the model. It's a practitioner model. As Victoria mentioned, you know, I've been in the industry for 25 years, working for larger companies, helping them improve their engineering practices and procedures. And like myself, folks have a similar background, CTO, VP of engineering, CPO. So we come with the mindset that we've been there and done that. We've gone through the trenches, we have all the war wounds, and we're here to make your company better. In regards to the offerings, really we go through the full life cycle of helping companies. Most of our companies are owned by PE firms, private equity, or portfolio companies, so we help them through that stages. So everything from a tech due diligence, where we assess the initial risk of buying a company and understand what are some of the areas for improvement. So helping to make sure that the business decision, that buying decision is very sound. And then once that company is bought, helping them with value creation activities such as this one. It's about how do we improve that company from a return on investment strategy. Sometimes that it takes the form of internal roles, an interim role, interim leadership role. Sometimes it takes the form of an assessment, helping to optimize their organization, their structure, their processes, helping to modernize their architecture, reduce technical debt, or, you know, shift quality and practices left, which we'll talk about today. We work in a variety of different industries. Healthcare, finance are our top, you know, verticals that we work in. And then as far as companies, we work everything from startups to small business to very large enterprise companies as well. So again, that's a little bit across like we'll wrap up the end. But with that, I'll turn it over to Jeffrey and I intersect with some of the offerings as we go through this program. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Kim. So what are we talking about today? Actually, I hope I know, but sorry, that was a rhetorical question. The transition between DevOps and over to DevSecOps. So other than the obvious of including security, what does that actually mean? How does that impact the goals and the execution towards those goals for the company? And very importantly, what does it mean down to the tool and process level to include security in this DevOps transformation? So I'm not going to bury the leads here. Fundamentally, the real goal of transforming here is to integrate the security aspects and practices of the traditional security space in a more broken down, iterative, and value-based way into the current DevOps processes. Most people are already somewhere along the journey between standard old waterfall or some form of agile towards the more DevOps process. They're already along that journey in some part. But including security in here changes some very important things. But what it doesn't change is the actual goal and the methodology behind it. DevOps is an evolution of Agile. DevSecOps is just the inclusion of security concerns and goals inside that same methodology. So everything that applies to Agile applies here. It's still focused on breaking things down into small, in this case secure as well, but small pieces of code, iterating frequently, failing often. But with security, you have this additional piece of you actually can't fail often in the same way that we normally talk about Agile failing. Traditionally in Agile, still sounds odd to say that, it's only a decade old, but in Agile, you would release, discover where you're failing, discover where you can improve, iterate, and the idea is to do it very quickly. The introduction of security, well, you can't afford to fail in security. You have to still get it right. So it adds a very big transformation inside this traditional Agile mindset. What it doesn't change though is, of course, automation. Automation is necessary for speed. Fundamentally, computer programs work faster than humans. And the whole point of being able to do this is to automate your delivery, automate as much of this process as possible, and really only use humans when you don't have a choice. And, look, fundamentally, most of us are familiar with the bottlenecks that the older security models really introduce. Lots of gates, lots of gatekeepers, tons of information flowing back and forth. Frankly, an old school way of handling risk mitigation that is focused on certainly making sure you never fail, but it also has a huge focus on things like knowing who to blame when it does. And fundamentally things like putting in checks to slow things down. The exact opposite of the goal for Agile and DevOps. So it's fundamentally a little bit of a push and a pull here. As you can kind of tell from the overall tone of the slide, adding security in changes a little bit of your goals with Agile or DevOps, and fundamentally reduces your ability to fail, which is a funny way to phrase it, but that's actually a very important thing, having the ability to fail.
I love this slide because, folks on the line are familiar with the Agile concept. And in the past, we've always kind of thought of the security over an island. And it's you're like bringing them into the fold, right? Bringing DevOps into the fold, just like you would do QA, UX designer. So it's really applying, concepts that people are familiar with, but just bringing security into the fold. So
it's funny, Victoria mentioned that it may have sounded like a throwaway line, but she's like, and importantly, QA, when she was discussing my little bio there. Right. And the reason I think it actually is important is this is a journey we did with QA already. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And we're making the same transformational journey now as we cover other areas of risk, like security or performance. But obviously, we're talking about security in DevSecOps.
Right.
All right, that was me setting the table. Now let's start eating the meal. So how is the current state, if you will, of security? What is that painful process people are going through now? So generally speaking, and everybody does this a little differently, but generally speaking, it's a handover. Same as a traditional waterfall model, where basically you're writing the code, you're delivering it, you're doing your tests, you're going through all of that, and then you're saying, okay, great, security team, experts, evaluate this. And they go through and they run through their checks and they find, oh, this library has vulnerabilities, we need to remediate, you got to fix this. And they're kicking things back over the wall. They're doing this mostly from a process perspective through what feels like an arcane tool, email. Sounds strange to call email ancient, but it is. It's an ancient way of communicating, where it's not easily trackable. It can be lost in your press of 800 other emails, or the slightly more modern ones will at least work inside of a ticket tracker like Jira or something like that. So you can still report on it and track it and ensure things get followed up on. But that's the real challenge. Closing that loop to resolution is pretty hard. So I'll walk through an example here. At WhiteSource, we focus on open source. So we have this big giant database of every open source vulnerability ever made, and people run a scanning agent and they determine what open source they have. They match it up against our database all automatically, and we do all sorts of things with this information. They can prioritize it, run it through policies, or they can do something like create a ticket, say in Jira. So great, that part's automated, but now you have a ticket that says, here's the vulnerability, you need to fix it. That's valuable, it's great. Somebody has to actually go and fix it. And we try to put a lot of value in that ticket to say, like, okay, here's how you fix it. Here's a button. You can evaluate the new recommended version. But there's still this gap between the security team and the people who are actually responsible for security based on just that kind of tooling. You still have this, there's a ticket open, somebody has to address it, somebody has to prioritize all the open tickets, balance it against all the other tickets they have that aren't security related, and you have this friction between a development team and the security team. Security team saying fix everything, and your development team saying, I've got 100 things to do. You're giving me way too many issues, way too many tickets. Like, I can't fix all of this. You guys need to tell me better what needs to be fixed. How urgent is it? Also, when I do fix it, sometimes I'm just updating a library. How do I know that the next version isn't going to have a similar issue? So that's the current state. I'm doing that mainly so I can draw a line to the preferred state. But Kim, with your experience, I'm sure you have more to say on the current state.
Yeah, and the way we've kind of started handle it with teams, because a lot of times is that the security team and the engineering are distinctly different teams. And what we try to do this, which I don't think is the right way of doing, because it is disjointed, as you mentioned, is that we try to allocate time. Like, say, engineering allocate X amount of time to tech debt or X amount of time to security issues. And why that's great, it still feels like the security team is a disjointed effort. And then, of course, engineering priorities always seem to trump some of these areas. So that confliction we always kind of see, and it's always hard to rationalize it because security is seen as that island and that kind of obstacle for getting things done versus, a pathway for at least resistance.
So I'm a security person, but I'm also a product manager. And the one thing that's always true is business usually trumps anything else. Mm-hmm. And even for me, it could be hard in this kind of environment. We don't work this way at WhiteSource, but previous companies, to sit there and actually try to prioritize these against things that are going to deliver value. Security is not something that is something I'm going to be able to charge more for on the business side, right? It's not a new feature. I'm not going to get a bigger market share, but it is 100% necessary for any modern product, especially in the SaaS world, to be secure. And security is a differentiator between your competitors and, frankly, table stakes nowadays.
Yep, absolutely agree. And unfortunately, security, when it does become an issue, it's already too late, which means your customers are aware of it, and most likely you've reputation damage or some other data security vulnerability that you don't want to manage.
And that's why I always bring up the term risk management, because that's what this is. This is a risk management practice. By the way, Thomas, I see your question. I want to get to it in the slide or two, so I'm not ignoring you. By the way, anybody else who's got questions, throw them in there. I actually like reading them and working them in. It makes this more interactive.
Great.
Okay, so how the heck do we get out of the current state into a better, more preferred state? Long story short, you need to actually change how we think about security and how it interacts with the development team. So, I love the title of this, Shifting the Mindset, Shift Left and Close the Loop. It's sort of got the entire content just in the title, because what you're doing here is you're changing the thought process. Security isn't a check. It is not something that is run after the fact, any more than something like quality of your application is. It has to be built in. If you're running it just as a check, you're slowing things down. Sure, that's never good, but you're also treating it the wrong way. It's fundamentally something that is easier and far more efficiently handled earlier in the cycle, which is the fun industry phrase we all use as shift left. It sounds kind of strange sometimes, but fundamentally, that's what we mean. Do it earlier in the development cycle. But what are the kind of like techniques that sort of implies, especially as they're commonly implemented? So first, you have to remove gatekeepers. You cannot have checks that take time. You can't have, oh, it's got to go run through this other team for approval. There has to be no gatekeepers, but that does not mean it's a free-for-all. You have to put up guardrails. And guardrails is the perfect term for this, because what you're trying to do is making sure that everything is funneled through at least this minimum acceptable risk that is automated, right? Nobody has to, when they're driving, nobody's putting up guardrails as you're driving. They're there, they're stable, they don't move. But fundamentally, they're not barriers. They're just keeping you from going too far astray. That said, you got to make sure those guardrails are wide enough. I'm really hammering home the road analogy here. You have to not create bottlenecks. If the guardrails are too tight, you're shoving 3 lanes down to 1. Just as bad as actually having an actual gatekeeper. You need to make sure that your guardrails are not slowing you down. If they are, you need to change your guardrails. This implies a lot in this one sentence, including things like measuring how fast you're going. But that's normal DevOps practices. Including security here does not change most of the standard DevOps practices, measuring your velocity, those kind of things. Fundamentally, what this, again, sort of implies, but I'm saying out loud, is this means security stops being one person's problem. Again, we're removing the gatekeepers. So you can't make it nobody's problem. Your alternative is to make it everyone's issue. And this can get taken out of context easily. Oh, everybody's got to be a security expert. That's not what anybody is saying. Any more than everybody has to be a Hadoop expert on your Scrum team, right? Fundamentally, you can still have subject matter experts. You can still have people who are advocating. You can still have all of those dynamics that you have in every other area of your team, right? But the responsibility does not revolve only around one person. If you release an insecure product, it's not Bill's fault. Why do I always use Bill? I don't even know anybody named Bill. Anyways, it's not John's fault. It's going to be everybody's fault. They need to all have that shared responsibility. The best way I've seen this usually executed is that on each Scrum team, you have somebody who focuses a little more on security, somebody who's more highly trained, understands things like how to remediate security vulnerabilities quickly and easily, an advocate or an evangelist is the fun terms that people use. But it's a little different than having a separate security team. That security team's purpose changes from being a bottleneck and a gatekeeper to being a education center, to being a tooling center, to being a here's how we implement security in our day-to-day processes, not as a double check and you have to go through me because I'm the expert, but because I'm enabling you, individual developer or developer team, with what you need to be able to do this yourself. So the fundamental role of a security team changes here as well. And, look, part of that is discussing. Nothing that you don't talk about it actually gets paid attention to. Not in any development team I've ever touched. If you're not talking about it, if you're not thinking about it, it gets ignored. So there is regular discussions. You do need to do that evangelism and education section of just really hammering home the importance. And the only way to actually facilitate regular discussions that I've seen work really well is, it's a dirty word, but metrics. Being able to measure how many escaped vulnerabilities you have. Being able to measure how much better you're doing with this new process. Where were we before? How many open vulnerabilities do we have that we were ignoring? How much have we lessened the risk? I could do a whole webinar on just ways of measuring risk, but it's very important to measure before and after whenever you're making any sort of mindset shift or transformation. And that measurement now becomes your way of facilitating a regular discussion, right? Maybe once a month you're going through and saying, okay, here's our security posture. Here's where we were before. Here's where we are now. Here's the activities we've done, keeping it top of mind. So Kim, I'm certain you've got some pieces there, and I've been talking so long I probably put people to sleep.
No, it's fine. I love the fact that it's something that everybody can relate to, right? We did this exercise with quality, right? Shifting quality left, bringing QA to the table, making it everybody's responsibilities, measuring unit tests, measuring code coverage, with same analogy as applied here. And I love the fact that, during the agile discussions, during planning, right, well, we're discussing, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we take this new module and we now have a mobile offering, right? This, the developer's thinking, oh, great, I can code this up here, and the UX person is thinking about the design, and the QA people's thinking about how we're going to test this on this mobile app, and the security SME is going to go, how are you going to authenticate, right? So bringing that conversation to the forefront and making sure it's part of that roadmap, it's part of the backlog. We discussed the authentication model during that initial design instead of, like you said, 2 months down the line when we're ready to release, right? So I love the fact we're bringing them to the discussion really early and often, and then they're bringing solutions, right? We've done this in this another part of business. We have authentication model you can use. We've already tested on Android and Apple. So again, they're bringing it out, not appearing as gatekeepers, but appearing as facilitators in this whole process. So we were seeing it more and more often. It's a pretty obvious thing. And it's just about, making sure they have a seat at the table and then bringing them into the loop. So closing that loop, like you said. So all good stuff.
It does feel obvious. And I'm constantly shocked how revolutionary it actually is to people.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe I'm biased because I've seen it so much, but fundamentally, this does feel obvious, which is actually usually a good sign you're on the right track.
But you have to be deliberate about it, though. You really have to change your model because, like I said, companies that we work with very often have that security outpost that it's very disjointed from the actual agile engineering process. And you need to be deliberate about bringing them into the fold.
Absolutely.
And setting up the metrics, like you said, and those are key.
And actually, that's a good lead in. It's like we practiced that. Because what metrics actually matter? And, this is something that's getting towards your question there, Thomas. The security issues, you asked, how do you grade them for business impact so that you can actually get the priority done? I'm going to differ with your question a little bit in a minute, but fundamentally, how do you measure the business impact in the first place? Look, we all know the benefits of DevOps usually, right? You go faster, you get cost reduction. Those don't change. Just because you're putting security in there doesn't mean the actual benefits change in those two regards, at least. The one thing it does mean, though, is you've now removed the extra costs of a separate security team bottlenecking everything, which is basically the exact same thing as the speed. Cost and speed are very related. Security is slowing you down if you're doing it in any other way. The other piece that it does is it bakes in, as Kim just was talking about, security by design. If I own the problem, I am going to put effort into preventing the problem. So putting the responsibility on the individual developers and development teams, instead of as a separate check, moves the responsibility. And when suddenly I'm responsible for something, I put more effort into it. That's really all it boils down to. Security by design to me is always, it's one of those fun phrases, like, oh, quality by design, privacy by design, security by design. It's a buzzword. But what it really means is holding people responsible and giving them the accountability of building it in earlier, basically by just making it their problem. This also all leads to the open discussion, as we just talked about, right? Again, if I'm responsible for something, I am going to want to talk about it. I'm going to want to make sure that people know the value that I provided. And I also want to make sure that, yeah, I'm building in the security by design, so I'm not wasting my own time fixing my own problems. I want to prevent them. All right. That's the business side, though. There's a ton of operational benefits, which actually a lot of people care more about. People like me in products care about the business side, right? Time to value of development velocity to actual dollars, all that. But even inside the actual DevSecOps team, there's huge operational benefits. The business benefits of these are very obvious. Less rework means faster time to value. But also there is this just fundamental, nobody likes doing things twice, pretty much ever. It's very frustrating to a developer to, let's say, implement a new open source library that they need to implement, go through the entire dev cycle, then it goes into a check. That check comes back with a security problem. Hey, you've got critical vulnerabilities in this. You need to update to something 2 versions ahead. Now they have to evaluate the new version, take a look and make sure it doesn't create any functional problems, update it, rerun all the checks they already ran, and then they might find out it still has a vulnerability. That is frustrating. And anytime you're frustrating developers, you're causing a huge amount of operational friction. So the idea here is that by building in security early, keeping things on up-to-date versions, keeping the identification of vulnerabilities as early as possible, right? So that you have less rework to do. In an ideal world, it's almost instant. There's like immediate flags that say, okay, there's this code you just entered has known vulnerabilities. You want to use this other thing. You want to be able to do that before it goes into build. And it does help enable just a general culture of constant iterative improvements. Adding security, putting it in early, does actually create a culture shift in the same way that we've been going through this culture shift as an industry for a long time, between big siloed teams that only care about their own piece towards some sort of ideal where I guess everybody cares about everything and they're all on top of it completely. That in constant iterative improvements, anytime you can reinforce the value of that, which is really obvious in security, frankly, is going to help you make that overall transformation as well, especially in a big company.
And what I love about this model, it's not so much the rework, because everybody hates rework. It's the context switching for me, because I develop something, I check it in, and then I'm done. I'm moved on to something else. And then 2 weeks later, I got security knocking on my door telling me I have a vulnerability. I have to reorientate myself with what I was working with 2 weeks ago and get back into it to fix that. So there's also that churn of just redoing it and getting back into context. So I love the fact that we're pushing this together and again, causing less rework, but also less churn for the individuals.
Oh yeah, any time gap immediately means context switching, and you end up with, wait a minute, what was I doing again? Yeah. Or at least if you're me, I'm like, oh, that was yesterday. I can't remember. So yes. Yeah. When was that? A year ago or a week ago? I don't remember.
I'm with you.
So I am going to go a little bit more deeper into some of the prioritization of this. But look, let's just get back to basics for a quick second. You need to know the goals. I think this is partially an excuse for this really awesome graphic, or to make me really regret skipping lunch today, because right now I really want a cupcake. Look, you have to bake security into all of your existing workflows. And I do mean all. It can't be, let's pick one piece. It can't just be, we're going to bake security into the build process, or we'll bake it into, the component selection process. It has to be all of them to get the real benefits. What is that process? Probably a good idea to talk about it for a second. Fundamentally, I'm not going to focus too much on the pre-development phase because there's enough to talk about in the process just from development onwards. Modern applications are incredibly modular, and they are interdependent to a very large degree. As I put it, usually, modern applications are composed as much as they are coded. We're basically reusing the same Lego bricks over and over. Whether that's internally, and you're doing things like pulling from a base image to generate a container, or whether that's just using open source. Our own statistics show that around 80% of all code in a given application is composed of open source. So you've got this huge amount of code you didn't write, but you own all the risks too. So fundamentally, that whole process starts in the actual development, selecting an open source component, for example. How am I going to architect this? There's a build phase. That matters. That's where you start combining things, good old continuous integration. There is usually a container aspect in most modern applications now. So it becomes important to have known good containers you can take from. But this also introduces an entire new layer of vulnerabilities because containers are usually based on some kind of image too many OS things. Operating system. Open source operating system, OS. Usually, you're pulling from Ubuntu, right? Or something like that. And that has its own vulnerabilities that have to be mitigated and handled. And very often, it's actually a separate team that owns that container from the development team that's utilizing it. And then look, you've got deployment. And the whole point of DevOps was originally to compress down this whole deployment piece into the development piece in the first place to make sure that everybody was on the same page so you didn't run into horrible problems that only affected operations. But that doesn't change for security. Security actually is one of the activities that never actually ends. There's always new vulnerabilities being found, new exploits, and that feedback cycle from deployment monitoring all the way back to the development is really important. So Kim, I don't know if you got somebody you want to throw in on there, but especially on the container registries, that's still a relatively new piece. Not every team I talk to is concerned about it yet, but I think everybody will be.
I think everybody's going in that direction, like you said, and I think everybody's trying to figure out how do we make things more modular? How do we isolate components more readily, right? And how do we deploy this kind of microservices environment? But either way, as we're thinking about this, it's about breaking things down more granular. So even if you still have a monolith, right? It's like, okay, you are where you're at, but where are those pieces you can start to pull apart, right? Where are those things you can start to pull apart? And as you pull them apart and think about things in a container perspective, think about what needs to go on from a security aspect, from a UX aspect. Again, thinking about it as a module from an end-to-end capacity, designing it upfront for security, for quality, for maintainability, for scalability. So all those abilities as well. So I think, as people are going down that path, this is again where we can kind of come in and help and guide folks through this transition period.
Yeah, and this can get very complicated pretty quick. You mentioned microservices. Fundamentally, when you start switching towards composing your application mainly of a whole bunch of reusable components, microservices or containers, or I'm abstracting here, but anything, it actually becomes very, very important to make sure that each piece is secure, and then check to make sure that the interactions are secure. You cannot start from a place of we're not sure if the piece is secure or not, because by the time you integrate all of these together, by the time you compose your actual application, it's too big, it's too complex, there's too many rabbit holes. You have to start with known good components before you can actually ensure the security of the application.
Yeah, and those guardrails come into really good play here because they allow you to, be distributed around your team, but know what good looks like, and know what the parameters you should place on each one of these individual modules.
And just fundamentally, there's a trust aspect there too. You have to be able to trust other people's services or
Absolutely.
containers,
Yep.
and that can be difficult if you're not all working on with the same guardrails.
Yep, same guardrails and blueprint. Yep, exactly.
This is a whole topic by itself, but every one of these phases has its own automation, building, testing, and actually the remediation. Personally at WhiteSource, we put a lot of effort into automating the remediation cycle because it's an area that's just underserved. Each one of these places actually has its own automation. They do not all have the same return on automation effort, but they all have a good return on automation. There is absolutely no reason in the world, in the modern world, to trying to identify, for instance, open source vulnerabilities yourself.
Mm-hmm.
It's just something that should be automated. Any more than being able to do the security checks should be done manually, right? Those should be triggered either as part of the build or as part of your test cycle. One part of your continuous delivery system should be triggering automated testing. That is, in an ideal world, automatically detecting your issues. Like I said, we put a lot of focus on also giving the remediation in an automated way. But realistically, that is actually very hard to do because you have this feedback loop back into functional. So for example, security vulnerability pops up in an open source component you've been using for a while, and the fix requires you to jump 3 versions. That can't be a fully automated process yet, for the simple reason of your application might have an issue with that new version that has nothing to do with security. So, we put a lot of effort in automating the process and giving information to people, but the actual, code update, we're not at the point yet where, the industry is okay with updating just things automatically. And then look, it all feeds right back in. So in an ideal world, you're cutting this off at the code phase, and you're only going through all these cycles when you have to. But this is not an ideal world. And frankly, vulnerabilities are found so frequently now that a vulnerability can pop up between when you selected the code and when it goes into build. And that could be a distance of a few hours. And in the security world, you don't have the luxury of time. Exploits hit basically as soon as a vulnerability is found. So fundamentally, it's important to automate to both catch those, but also because realistically, the return on investment for automation in each of these phases is individually quite large. Sorry, I could talk forever about automation. So I could probably talk forever about anything, right, Kim?
Yes, of course. Yes, yeah, no.
But let me talk a little bit about the prioritization here. And this is going right back over to your question there. Prioritization is an art as much as it is a science. There is no one size fits all, but there are good, oh God, I'm going to use the word I hate, best practices that generally speaking are a good idea to follow. Everything starts with detection. It just does. You need to know what problems you have. Like I just said, it's ideal if you can automate that. And there's really no reason you can't. But once you've got all of the problems listed, you do need to prioritize them, and there are always more problems than you have time to solve. So what are some of the methods people follow for prioritizing what they really need to focus on? They roughly break into 3 categories in terms of prioritization strategies for me. And in an ideal world, you're implementing all 3. The first is the area of the product. Sounds simple, but guess what? A security vulnerability in your credit card processing is a lot more important than a security vulnerability on your UI layer that could, might accidentally, show some information you don't want to show, but it's not credit card information. It's, the person's last name when you're trying to only show the first name. Security vulnerabilities are not all created equal, but more importantly, different areas of your application do not have the same risk. Credit card processing, login information, things that are entering data into your database for good old-fashioned SQL or cross-site scripting, those are higher areas of concern. I have lost track of the number of people who are treating internal applications and internal uses the exact same as external. Guess what? Internally, security vulnerabilities are much less impactful on internal-only tools than they are on the tools that you're surfacing for external. It's important to know which areas of the product, which vulnerabilities lie in. So that's one way of prioritizing. The second is what I call kind of the brute force, which is, okay, I've got all these vulnerabilities. Fortunately, they all come with severities. I'm just gonna say I'm gonna mitigate all the high ones. Great. It's better than no prioritization. It's not usually enough on its own. And the main reason is, again, context. A security vulnerability is not the same for every use. It might be critical if you're using it in this particular way. If you're not, it could be very low. And fundamentally, there is this third way, which is something we've put a lot of effort on, which is, am I even touching the thing that's vulnerable? Packages are how most people consume a large chunk of their components for development. I'm grabbing Node. I'm not grabbing some small little tiny piece. Just because a vulnerability is present in a package or a library does not mean I am actually calling the method that is vulnerable. So this becomes another way of prioritization, kind of the third way, which is, okay, what am I actually touching? We have a term for it called effectiveness. Is this vulnerability effective? Can I reach it? Is it in an area of a library that I'm not using that area at all? Well, that lessens the risk because the likelihood of it being a problem is now 0. And good old-fashioned risk calculation, impact times likelihood. One of those go to 0, don't worry about it. So the best way of handling prioritization combines all three. What areas of my application is this in? What is the severity of this just in general? Is this critical? Is it high? There's all sorts of great metrics to be able to use there. And finally, am I even touching this? And in an ideal world, you stitch all three of these together in a nice little policy that says, okay, if it's in this area, I care about medium vulnerabilities, and I'm not too worried about whether or not I'm touching it because it's the credit card processing and I better freaking fix everything. Versus, I don't know, this is, this area of the product, all it's doing is, some string transformations. It's not doing much. Okay, I care if it's critical or not. I'm going to fix the critical bugs, but anything below critical, I'm only going to care about it if I'm actually touching the vulnerable method. Other than that, I'm not going to think about it. The risk is too low. There's not a high enough impact to actually be able to focus on it. This is where the art form comes in, because somebody has to make those judgments. There's no good automated way to say this area is credit card related and much higher. But it's also where the chance for automation arises again. Because again, it goes back to those guardrails. How do I implement that kind of policy, right?
Yeah, and I think the first step of that is developing that framework, right? So working with your team to understand what are those 3 areas and how you're going to treat them, and developing that framework before incidents happen, right? Because that will make your triage process go a lot smoother if you guys are using consistent frameworks throughout.
And it can be very hard to do, is my polite way of saying that. So look, there's 100 other areas in here, which is, I'm looking through the questions here now, right? You know, some people are like, which people are you eliminating from the process to save money? Like, I'll cover that in a second, but we're not, right? You know, there is fundamentally a lot of implications for these kinds of policies. But the important thing is to start thinking of them, start putting them up, and realistically have them in place before you actually try to make the business transformation from DevOps to DevSecOps. I didn't move the slide forward when I talked about effectiveness. I probably should have. This is what the problem is with me. I'm sorry, I got excited to talk about it and didn't show the slide, but we actually kind of covered all of that. So, you know, look, fundamentally, we're just recapping what I just said. I just refused to move the slides forward because I got excited to talk about it. But I will cover, just as a recap, the focus on remediation. Remediation is what matters. Issues don't matter if you don't fix them. Detecting, prioritizing, and then fixing them is what actually delivers the value, not just one of those pieces. So you have to be able to do it based, like I said, on business priority, which is my way of saying which area of the product, because that's actually how you measure that. It's a much bigger problem if it's I'm exposing my entire database than it is if it's, you know, some UI issue. Of course, the severity. There's one layer I completely forgot to mention, which is there a fix available? That matters. There are vulnerabilities that have no fixes available yet. It's very hard to prioritize something that you can't actually fix. So that's very important to keep track of. And then just a little bit more, if you will, advice on here. You need to be able to understand the fix process for a security vulnerability. You can't just assume that going all the way to the most recent is a good idea. As a matter of fact, it's usually a better practice to update to the most secure earliest version, the first version that has no known security vulnerabilities. There's a whole lot of reasons for this, but in general, you introduce other risks when you do things like update to a library that came out yesterday. That new version hasn't been out there very long. You probably have quality risks. And very often what I see is people who are like 3 years out of date and they're like, oh, I better update to the most recent. Well, look, you're about to go through 3 years worth of functional risk and integration risk. That's probably not the best idea. So I rushed through that last little bit because we got a bunch of good questions I wanted to make sure Kim and I got a chance to answer, and I wanted to leave time for.
Yeah, let's get to the questions. So, okay.
Great. So here, let me read out a couple. Is serverless computing a more secure architecture and easier to manage? I have some opinions on this, but Kim, I'm curious on yours.
Go ahead if you want to start first, and then I'll chime in.
No. That was my short answer. No, serverless computing doesn't inherently become more secure. It actually just moves some of the problems around. You still have the same problems. Serverless has some advantages, but to be honest, it's also one of the newer areas, and so people have put a lot less thought into best security practices, et cetera, in serverless. It's still something that most companies I'm at least talking to not only aren't really implementing yet, they're really just understanding what that would be and what it would look like. The one thing I will say is most people who do serverless are also building new applications, so you have less of this old load and old architecture of spaghetti code that you're worried about. So serverless architectures tend to be a little more secure because they're more recent, but that has very little to do with the fact that it is serverless computing itself.
Yeah, and I would agree. I would go back to the fact that because it's newer architecture and people are building components on serverless architecture, you have to think individually about those components and how they talk to each other. So it goes back to the conversation we had about making sure there's guardrails on how you build a component safely and securely, and make sure when you talk to other components, you're talking to safe components.
It really does. Anything you're building in serverless is sort of inherently incredibly dependent on other things.
Yep, exactly.
That's what it's for. So does security have dependencies like performance? And how will I know if security vulnerabilities show up only in certain performance conditions? Whew. It's
That's
a really
interesting.
good question. The short answer is every vulnerability I've ever seen has a ton of information on it about what actually creates the conditions for that vulnerability. There is a additional wrinkle there in that performance can create functional problems that can lead to security issues. Man, I wish I could tell one story, but it would reveal who the customer is, and I don't want to do that. They would not be happy with me. I will say it this way. Sometimes performance can create conditions that are, when one piece of functionality breaks, it can open up a hole. But it goes back to making sure that each of your components is secure in and of itself. If that is true, generally speaking, performance won't create the breakdowns that open up a security hole if each piece is secure by itself. When you're depending on something else running and working correctly, that's when performance has an issue. Dependencies across services or contain whatever components.
Yeah, and that's going to be the most frustrating problems to solve when there's conditions around things happening and those non-functional requirements. So that's a tricky one.
It can be very, very hard. I will say, I don't think it's inherently different from your quality issues in performance.
That's correct. Yeah.
Again, it's just an interdependence problem almost always.
Yeah.
Somebody asked if there's going to be a recording for this session. That's an easy question. Yes. We'll send that out afterwards. So if you missed the beginning, which was absolutely amazing, by the way, you really missed out. You'll be able to go back and review. Oh, our friend Thomas here had another really good one, which is we read release notes, but we don't code review open source changes. I feel we are just replacing having old vulnerable libraries with having new vulnerable libraries. What are the best practices? Whew. There's 3 things I want to unpack in there. Kim, do you have any? I don't want to dominate here.
No, go ahead, and I'll chime in when you missed some. So.
So first, oh my God, you read release notes? Nobody should read those. They're really horrible. Ideally, you have that automated in one way or another. Look, I know you still have to review it to see what's in there, but reading release notes is painful, so I just feel bad for you. But you don't code review open source changes, which nobody does. Like realistically, very few people code review open source on their own. Look, this is a never-ending race. The best practices is always to keep things as up to date as you can. Generally speaking, if you're doing regular updates on most of your open source components, meaning every time there's a new version that comes out, even a dot release, right? You're going to be reviewing it and updating it. You're putting yourself in a much better place, because if a vulnerability pops up, you have less of a gap to go close. There is this concern about having new vulnerable libraries, which I get, but you can only be as up to date as the world is. Fundamentally, look, if you're on the most recent version, you're on the most recent version. If there's no vulnerabilities in a version that hasn't been discovered yet, guess what? There will be. So you can only keep as up to date as you possibly can. It is a very good idea to try to keep as up to date as you can, though. And the best way to do that is honestly to automate everything you possibly can. Like functional testing matters there. Your update risk is mainly functional. You should be able to update it, be able to do an automated test run, and make sure it doesn't break any of your functionality. If you can't do that, that's where I would focus.
And I think it starts even in the beginning, like making sure that you have a really good open source policy, knowing what open source components you actually bring into your system, figuring out where you actually physically store them, figuring out how you tag that in the code, right? If you don't know what they're in, getting clean, understanding your baseline, what open source is out there, using WhiteSource to scan that, and then staying clean, right? And that's all about integrating it with your processes and tools. So, it makes things easier. And like I said, you can automate a lot of this. So when you bring in a new component, it tags it. It automatically builds those release notes for you.
Incidentally, somebody mentioned they were using Renovate, which is actually an open source project that WhiteSource sponsors. So I love seeing that. Renovate is a great tool to do dependency updates, but it does add one additional problem, which is if you're always on the most recent, anytime a new vulnerability is found, you're going to be remediating it because most new vulnerabilities are found in newer releases. This is still the best that you can really be sure of is the most recent. But yeah, it does mean that, you also need an automated remediation cycle there. And incidentally, one thing we just added into Renovate is something called merge confidence to show the non-security risk of a given update. For instance, how old it is. Like I said before, you probably don't want to update to something that came out yesterday.
All right. There's a really good question in here about having the trade-off with having usability and making applications secure. And you being a product manager and a security person, we'll put you on the spot for this one. So do you agree what's the trade-off, and what is your thoughts on that when you're making trade-off decisions about usability and security?
The trade-off is not the same as it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, I would have said usability is king. Nowadays, customer expectations, and I don't care if your customer is a business or a consumer, is that you are always secure. It is now a baseline. It is similar to me to just be saying that your application works. There is almost no risk greater in today's world than a big security breach, and you need to be able to prevent that. And sometimes that might come at the cost of, delaying that new feature you want to do a little bit. But it's so important to the baseline of whatever your application is, it sort of trumps it. Now, you have to be smart about it. And if you don't prioritize your security issues, you should, because it is a risk mitigation strategy. And that means you can only mitigate it, not eliminate it. But fundamentally, there should not be a trade-off between usability and security, because security's impact is so high. It dwarfs any oh boy, that, we really need this feature to compete with our competitors. Well, guess what? If you have a breach and your competitor doesn't, that feature doesn't matter anymore. It's too high of an impact.
Right.
Okay.
And I don't think, go ahead, sorry, I think we're at time.
Yeah, we're just approaching time, but really quickly, just what tools do you recommend for static security and quality scans?
Whew. There is so many nuances on that question. The problem is, my answer is it depends on what you're doing, so much. Some static tools are better for certain things than others. Quality scans is all over the place.
There's some great free ones, open source ones, to start with SonarQube. It's a wide one, but it does depend on what you're trying to do.
Okay, maybe I can follow up on that question via email. But
yep.
I know we're at the end of time here, so Kim, Jeff, I really want to thank you for your presentation. So next steps from here, Jeff, next slide. Today is just really one part in shifting left to embed security with development. So we're offering a free consultation for anyone that wants to sit down with us and just spend an hour one-on-one to go through your situation, where we can give some key observations. More than happy to sit down and help you identify some great opportunities there. So please reach out to me via email, and I can help coordinate. You can email info@crosslaketech.com, or just really respond to any of the webinar reminder emails, and I'll help get it scheduled. Again, thank you to everyone who's on the call today. Really hope that you found this information helpful to guide your journey. Today is really just one step on improving your organization. So don't stop here. Yep, exactly. We do have a webinar coming up on March 10th on how to unlock value in your company with data architecture. So you can easily sign up at crosslaketech.com/resources. Again, that's March 10th, and I hope to see you there. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you, guys.